Last few years, a rather staid and conservative area of San Francisco, with its apex at the corner of Haight and Ashbury Streets, has literally gone to pot. Not only has it gone to pot, that is marijuana, but it has also gone to opium derivatives such as morphine and heroin, cocaine, barbiturates, amphetamines, pale, and LSD. In the last year, you might say this area has gone even one step farther. It has gone to the hoods. In this last year, the hippies have gradually left Haight-Ashbury and have been replaced by a troublesome element. The flower people, or hippies, have graduated from the school of indifference and gone south to Big Sur. Now, among the reasons for this graduation or movement is, one, the great publicity this area has had in the last year and the great numbers of people flocking to the area, the great fear of hepatitis, which has been brought about by the usage of hypodermic needles, unsanitary hypodermic needles, and administration of the drugs. There have been fights and riots. Just in the last 2 weeks, 128 people were arrested for riots, and just in the last week, there were 2 people murdered. A shopkeeper from this area said that during the last year, the area has changed 100%. The kindly flower people have gone, and the troublemakers have moved in. Now, the abuse of drugs has not disappeared from this area. It has become highly organized now by the criminal element. And here we have some of the basic problems of drug abuse. The addiction or habituation, which lead to unsanitary conditions and to such diseases as hepatitis. The growth of crime caused by the abuser trying to get the drug and going to great limits in order to get it, and the development of a drug traffic by organized crime in order to take advantage of the growing market or to help it grow. The result is misery, mayhem, murder, and social values die. Now, it has been asked both by our society and those who claim to be outside of our society, the hippies, just what kind of social values are necessary to this society. Are we living under the social values of a period prior to our time, and our time being one in which these values no longer apply? Another question asked, are the values going to ruin because of a certain dissident element? Some maintain that these values, or at least certain of these values, are of universal validity and perpetual validity, that the abuse of drugs is not limited to the modern era, but that it existed in all times. These people would agree that man is an animal who lives in society with others, and that this, by definition, involves the regulation or control of behavior, any behavior detrimental to that society. Now, Aristotle, in the 4th century BC, would also admit that this control must be done by 2 means. One is by the self-control of the individual, and this must be brought about by education, both by the family and the relationships between the members of the family, and by the educational institutions. Secondly, this must be brought about by the laws or the legislation, customs, traditions, which are the embodiment of the constitution of the state. The laws then have to be maintained by a police force and by also at the same time and in conjunction with the education, a judiciary body. However, the chief reliance, Aristotle would insist, would be upon the pride of the individual in the society in which he lived and the sense of shame attached to any antisocial act of an individual. He would desire to contribute to that society for its own sake and for his own benefit as a member of this society. Now, Aristotle would not deny that pleasure is an important part of the society in which he lived. However, he would insist that the abuse of drugs is a detriment to the character of the individual who is a part of the society, and thus detrimental to the society itself, not even including such items as the consequent unsanitary conditions or the consequent destruction of social values. But drug abuse existed long before Aristotle, long before the 4th century. It goes back way into the prehistoric period. We cannot expect to explain exactly what it is in looking at the history books, at the original and primary sources. First, because these sources often do not explain the abuse of a drug, but often its usage. On the other hand, there are some explanations of abuse. Now, when a drug is associated with a religious rite or with the magic of a religious rite, it is very difficult to determine whether it is use or abuse, especially the ones that go back into antiquity, such as the natural drugs, to distinguish these from such synthetic drugs as, say, heroin. Homer, writing in the 9th century, talks about the drug nepenthe or ambrosia, and this is a drug of forgetfulness, and it is associated with the gods as early as the 9th century BC. This is. In the Middle Ages, we find that drugs were used in witchcraft as ointments to enable one to fly through the air with the greatest of ease. But unlike the man on the flying trapeze, this was done through the application of drugs such as aconite, deadly nightshade, henbane, cannabis, or hashish as it's called. All this was associated with sorcery, astrology, superstition, and partially religion, and all this enshrouded the use of drugs. Indeed, there is not great change even up to the 16th and the 17th century in Europe. Even elsewhere, you may find this is much the same. In Europe, devils and witches are still around, producing excitement, delirium, hallucinations through their ointments in the 16th and 17th century. By this time, though, cocaine has been added to the list of drugs. Now, it too was associated with religious rites in the country of its origin, South America. Peyote, also from South America and Mexico, was found in the 16th century, not very distant in time from the finding of cocaine. It too was used in religious ceremonies, and indeed in the 19th century it was included as part of the religious ceremonies in the Native American church, and this church was not condemned by the Supreme Court for its usage of peyote in religious ceremony. Probably the drug best known and also most abused in all of history is opium. It is from the juice of the poppy bulb and is usually collected at dawn when the juice dries up. It is known to cause sleep and relieve pain. and this is from prehistoric times. Indeed, we know from the refuse heaps of the Swiss lake dwellers, going back to approximately 5,000 years ago, that there was the poppy seed and poppy heads, and that these were cultivated at this time. The name opium comes from the Greek word opion. And this opion means poppy juice. Now, as far as we can tell, it originated in Sumeria, probably somewhere between 4,000 and 3,000 BC, some 2,500 years before the name opion was given to it by the Greeks. It was well known for its abuse in Sumerian times, and it seems to have been developed before Sumerian times in the lower Euphrates Valley here in the Middle East. Now, this drug opium was transported by the Muslims, by the Mohammedans, especially in the 9th century, and from the 9th century on, we find, this is the 9th century AD, on, we find the Muslims spreading this all over, especially from India in the 10th century to Persia at the same time. But before this, we find Homer, as far back as the 9th century BC, talking about opium, or nepenthe, or ambrosia as he calls it, as a drug put in this drink, ambrosia, and it brings forgetfulness and joy. This is seen in the Odyssey at the time when Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, or Ulysses in Latin, is visiting Menelaus, and Menelaus's wife Helen, the daughter of the god Zeus, gives to the people who are there talking to Telemachus a drink to overcome their grief and to make them forget about this grief. The grief is generally because of the death of Odysseus, the father of Telemachus. The secret of this comes from Egypt, and Helen, as a goddess, or as the daughter of a goddess, was considered godlike. Again, a religious usage. The Egyptians were using the drug already. The secret was given to Helen from Egypt, and therefore we can conclude that it was used far before the Homeric period in Egypt. Indeed, in biblical times, there were remedies written in Egypt on papyrus, and one such papyrus was called the Ebers papyrus, E-B-E-R-S, and this was found in modern times. On this papyrus were written remedies such as opium given to children who cried all the time in order to keep them quiet. There was a plant called the spen, which we know as opium, which was forced through a sieve and mixed with water, and this was the opiate given to the children. It is also recorded on the papyrus that the goddess Isis gave to her great-grandfather a drink which got rid of his headache, and his grandfather was the sun god Ra, the father of all gods in Egypt. This juice of the poppy cured him. Also in biblical times, we find King David cured of fits of depression and melancholy by this drink concocted for him. Some time later, in the time of the Maccabees, we find that John Hyrcanus, the leader of the Maccabees, was putting the poppy head on his bronze coins. And indeed, in this time of about 129 BC, the poppy appeared on Roman coins at this time also, showing its widespread usage. This is about 129 BC, about 20 years later. So popular had opium become that the king of Pontus at the time, Mithridates VI, announced that he had discovered a universal cure-all for all diseases, and this he named after himself, called it Mithridatum. Besides the juice from boiled vipers, it was mainly opium. Now, outside of the Middle East and into the Roman period, we find such great writers as Pliny, who describes the addictive properties of opium. We find also Dioscorides, also in the 1st century BC, telling how to extract the opium from the poppy bulbs. Ovid, the personification of love, personifies the sweet rest that comes from the poppy and personifies the poppy in a field of poppies surrounding his house, thus showing eternal rest. In the 20th century, we also see an indication of this. Some of you may have read The Wizard of Oz or have seen the movie. The heroine, Dorothy, is bewitched to sleep by the wicked witch of the West, I believe, in a field of poppies, indicative also of the sleep-producing tendencies of these poppies. Now, in the Roman period, we do not find condemnation of the abuse of the poppy, unlike in the Greek period. In the Greek period, we have as early as the 5th century BC, Diagoras of Melos, M-E-L-O-S, who states that the poppy creates an unnatural, abnormal situation, and he condemns it. Some 2 centuries later, in the 3rd century BC, Erasistratus of Chios goes so far as to declare that all poppies should be banished. This is not true in Rome. Rome seems to like the poppy, or at least to use it without comment. Virgil, for instance, talks about the sleep-inducing properties of poppy, yet this is mainly in the way of comment, no condemnation. Lucian, some 100 years later, also talks about the same thing. Nero was subject to excitement, particularly at such times as Rome was burning down or something like this, and his physicians told him to take the juice of the poppy in order to rest his nerves. We find also at this time a writer by the name of Petronius. This is about 80 A.D. Petronius was a scatological writer who told about the growth in riches of the ex-slaves and of the pomposity of the nouveau riche. And one of the odd dishes that he tells us in his Satyricon is a dish consisting of sausages made from mice, dormice, over which was poured a sauce made of honey and opium, poppies. And he says that this must have been a very soporiferous dainty and as good as owl pie for such as want a nap after dinner. Now, in the Middle Ages, opium was used by the witches, or so-called witches, oddly enough, with some addictive and some good qualities or good effects at the same time. At the same time, physicians, or those who called themselves physicians, emphasized that all drugs were the work of sorcerers, witches, and the devil. And indeed, as late as the 17th century, we find that the physicians do not dabble in the witchcraft of drugs. Now, it's possible that opium was introduced into Europe by the Moors from Spain. Probably, and more likely, the opium was introduced by Venice, and I believe that the earliest incidence is in the 12th century A.D. The Mohammedans spread its influence all through the 10th and 13th century to China. It was widely known in such distant places as Egypt and Asia Minor, and India, certainly. The Portuguese botanist Garcia Abhorto found that men became oblivious of physical and mental problems and became wise after opium eating. This is particularly true where he was living at the time in India. In England, it was well known by the 16th century, and by the 17th, it was advocated as a cure-all by Thomas Sydenham in the middle of the 17th century. By the 18th century, opium was very popular, and by the 19th, we have more popularity due to the extraction of a derivative called morphine. This was done in 1806 by a German pharmacist named Sir Turner, and he isolated the major principal narcotics, morphine, out of opium. Now, during this 19th century, we find opium very popular among the writers and the intellectual set. The poets Samuel Coleridge, the author of Kubla Khan and the Ancient Mariner, was an opium addict. And this is shown in his preface to Kubla Khan, where he talks about worlds outside of his own induced by drugs. Francis Thompson, also a poet of this time, was hooked on the drug. Balzac in France in 1830 emphasized that morphine was increasing the population of hell. This he did in his comedy, in his play, the Comédie du Diable. Now, in 1821, we have one of the most famous of all writers on opium, Thomas de Quincey. He wrote the Confessions of an English Opium Eater. This was not only a confession of the difficulties he had, the dreams and the beautiful and wonderful feelings he had, but it was also an advertisement. For not long after this, about 1842, we find William Blair, an expatriate Englishman living in America, writing The Opium Eater in America. And opium, to him, was a drug introduced to him by De Quincey, and one which was brought about good feelings. It was still popular in France in the 1920s. You've probably heard of Jean Cocteau. In 1929 and in 1930, he wrote a little book called Opium, Diary of a Cure. And he was at the time in a sanitarium in Paris, taking the cure for opium. Yet when we think of opium, what immediately comes to our mind is the opium den of China, or possibly of Chinatown, USA. It is likely that the major source of influence on the United States comes from the China and Chinatown, the opium dens of both. This is particularly true in the 20th century. The opium traffic in China was well established by the 15th century. We know by the 17th that a new impetus was given to the usage of opium by the discovery that it could be smoked. And by 1729, the abuse of this was so great that the Emperor of China at the time, Yung Qing, prohibited opium. Now, 1729, we have data telling us about the importation of opium into China. The data at this time comes principally from the Portuguese at Goa, who were doing most of the exporting to China at this time. Opium continues to grow more and more popular, even though it is prohibited in China. For instance, in 1729, there were 200 chests of opium imported into China that were known, that is. By 1790, this was increased to 4,000 chests. By 1830, 25,000. By 1858, 70,000 chests. This does not even include smuggling or shipments from other nations outside of Portugal and Britain. This great increase occurs despite the fact that there are two opium wars in the 19th century between the British and the Chinese, and one in 1840, the other in 1855. This does not prevent the importation of opium into China. Particularly, the British maintain a monopoly of opium, or at least a large percentage of the opium. Now, beginning in about 1858, we have the Chinese entering into the production of opium themselves. This is the end of this Second Opium War. The Treaty of Tientsin gave to Britain Hong Kong, and we find that the Chinese decide, well, why fight it? Let's join it. So they go into opium or poppy cultivation also. By 1906, the addiction, the disease, the death rate is so high that the government decides to give up cultivation and went so far as to enter into an agreement with the major source of its supply, that is British India, to both give up cultivation and also the import-export of opium. This was agreed upon by the British at the time, so that there was no difficulty. By 1917, some 11 years later, we find some change. Opium has declined in its popularity, at least insofar as the import of opium on record is concerned. But it's interesting to note that opium can be procured from the international city in Shanghai, which is not under control of China. It can be procured from Hong Kong, which is British and not under Chinese government. And it can also be procured from Macau, which is Portuguese. All of this without restriction. The Chinese have only to walk across the line and move into the thousands of opium dens all along the streets. Furthermore, smuggling went up enormously. This is due to the fact that the British continue to auction off their excess opium every month at Calcutta, and whoever wanted to buy it would come and get it. And opium into China cannot be counted in terms of boxes or chests, but it does not seem to have declined. So that by 1917, although there is some evidence of decline as far as figures go, China is still very much deep in the opium stupor. Now, many of the governments of the 20th century were shocked by this. France and Germany found opium addiction growing along their seacoasts, being brought in from China or being brought by across the Mediterranean to France. The United States found opium addiction growing greatly in the country. The super clean individual, President Teddy Roosevelt, was so shocked that he proposed an international investigation in 1909. The result of this was an international opium committee, which met in Shanghai, and the Opium Convention, as it was called, made many recommendations that were to be copied and elaborated upon by most of the succeeding drug conventions of the 20th century. It then was a step, the first step in this direction. There were Hague Conventions, which probably will be commented on later in this course, in 1913 and 1914, dealing with opium. Recommendations were for control and also at the same time the prohibition of opium going into the areas where it is illegal. This Hague Convention, both of them in 1913, 1914, were ratified by the peace treaties ending World War I, 1919, 1920. And it is under these treaties and also under the League of Nations that we will find control and prohibition of opium continuing. But perhaps the second best known of the addictive drugs is cocaine. It was first found by the conquistadores, by Francesco Pizarro in 1533. And he found it in Peru, where the Indians were using it as what was called a euphoric, to bring about a feeling of well-being on the part of them, to give them added strength, to curb their appetite, to give them endurance in long and treacherous hikes up mountains carrying heavy burdens. It was found in the form of cocoa leaves. The cocoa leaves were chewed, mixed with limestone by the Peruvian Indians, and such was the dependency upon the leaf that many people tried to make profit off it and refused to allow the Indians to chew it unless they paid a small fee. The Spaniards did this, although it was prohibited by the Lima Convention. This is in was the Second Council of Lima, about 1559, that brought this about. And in 1560, both the chewing of cocoa leaves, restrictions, that is, there's chewing of cocoa leaves by the Spanish, and also the enslavement of Indians for plantation and mine work was prohibited by the Spanish government. All of this made no difference at all. The Spanish government, by the mid-17th century, had realized that here was an important monopoly, and by the mid-17th century, Spain had taken over the monopoly of cocoa leaves and had introduced it into Europe as an addictive drug. Now, this is the mid-17th century. It was not to reach great popularity until after the mid-19th century. About 1858, pure cocaine was extracted from the leaves of the cocoa plant. And by the beginning of the 20th century, we find cocaine perhaps second to opium as an addictive drug in popularity. Now, a drug that is as well known as opium in history is the drug from the hemp plant. This goes back to the Stone Age. The hemp plant is called cannabis sativa in Greek, and we often refer to it in journals by that name. Its derivatives are probably better known. Hashish is one. Bhang is very popular in India, ganja in the Far East, daga, and better known to you, marijuana. Marijuana. This is from the hemp. Hemp is not usually considered a physiologically addictive drug as cocaine and opium are, because the cases where we have found any addiction are so extremely rare that we can't say that there is real addiction to it. Now, this cannabis sativa, or hemp, is a plant which seems to grow everywhere. It's often called the devil's weed. It's perhaps found mostly in Mexico, as far as the Western Hemisphere is concerned, where marijuana, particularly the weakest form of the drug, is cultivated. The strongest form of the drug is hashish. Marijuana and bhang being the same thing, ganja or ganha a weaker form. Now, this is probably the most ancient of all drugs. It cannot be traced to its origins. It seems to go back to mythology. As early as 2000 BC, we find the first record of it in China. It is mentioned in the Bible, Daniel, in the book Daniel the 4th of the Bible. The Syrian king at the time is Nebuchadnezzar. Probably heard of him. Nebuchadnezzar was described as smit with madness and did eat grass with oxen. This means he was high on hashish. Now, in India, as early as 800 BC, we find the drug there. It is mentioned by Herodotus in 450 BC as a narcotic already abused. It is seen in the Arabian Nights tales in the 11th century. King Omar uses it to produce sleep in Princess Britsa. Marco Polo tells us about it. In his travels, he comes upon a band of thieves in Persia. These thieves are led by a man who enticed the various members of the gang into committing criminal activity by giving them hashish and then taking it away and saying, either you do or you don't get hashish. And the result was the creation of a band called the Hashashins, or assassins, without pronouncing the H, which is the origin of our word assassins. Marco Polo also commented on the great abuse of this drug, hashish. It's often called the pill of gaiety, and it was used as a hypnotic, a euphoric. In the Middle Ages, we find it is again linked with sorcery. The abbot Arnold of Lubeck. This is Lubeck in the 12th century, when it was part of the Hanseatic League, says that it is taken by sorcerers, and people are made susceptible to inducement into criminal activities by these sorcerers through the use of hashish. In other words, people who otherwise would not do things are made to do things by use of this hashish, or hashish. This has often been used as an aphrodisiac for erotic incitement. In the 19th century, we find the drug used by probably the greatest assemblage of writers of any drug, starting with the French writer Théophile Gautier. Gautier was one who found paradise in the drug. Baudelaire, the great and beautiful, often erotic poet, describes his reactions to it and the hallucinations which he has. Bayard Taylor, Fitzhugh Ludlow, Balzac in France, Charles Lamb in England, and Alexandre Dumas in France were all takers of hashish and all dearly loved it. It is only in the 20th century that we find the American form of the hemp plant being found. This is marijuana, and it is called the American vice by the French and English when the Americans introduced it into France and England. The American vice. The smoking of marijuana is today very popular in the United States, and it has been for a long time. The supply of the leaf is readily available. Anyone can walk over to Mexico and sit down at a bar and ask for marijuana, a pound, and taking into consideration the amount of dishonesty of the person who's selling it, can walk back into the United States with it, or take the car and bring it back. It is not too difficult. It is also found in Minnesota, where the greatest amount of marijuana has been found growing up to this time, cultivated. It is also found growing wild in such places as Indiana. So it can be found anywhere, and it grows wild almost anywhere. It was carefully cultivated along the Seine in London in the 19th century and in the back gardens of the small houses. It is a depressant, a euphoric, and an aphrodisiac, as also is cocaine. Now, a new type of drug has become very popular in the 20th century. Not exactly new insofar as it goes back a long way, but new in the sense of its popularity. This is the hallucinogenic and psychedelic drug. This includes peyote, or peyote as it's sometimes spelled, and LSD 25. I've mentioned peyote before, or peyote. It is first mentioned in history by a Spanish historian in 1580, about 1580. His name is Sahagún, and he wrote a general history of New Spain. The Indians had long used this for their sacred rites. They called it the flesh of God. The Spanish had a different view and called it devil's flesh. Now, when the Indians became Christian, they changed their name for it and called it flesh of our Lord. It didn't seem to lose any popularity at all during the different periods. It was said to produce visions, to encourage the natives to battle each other with great courage, without fear, without feeling hunger and thirst. Despite this early mention, however, we know little about the nature and substance, nor was it greatly used until about the end of the 19th century. At this time, men named Louis Lewin, L-E-W-I-N, brought back a sample from America, and with the aid of the director of the Berlin Botanical Museum, established it as an alkaloid substance producing mescaline, which is a vision-inducing drug. Now, many in the 20th century have experienced visions, moving bright color from the buttons of the peyote plant when it is balled up and chewed. And you may chew as many as 20 buttons a day, if you wish. A French pharmacist found new beauty in life, a man named Alexandre Rouillet, at the beginning of the 20th century, as well as did Havelock Ellis, whom you probably know, in 1902, found new beauty in peyote. Recently, Aldous Huxley, the great novelist of the 20th century, has found new beauty in life through peyote. Havelock Ellis called this drug artificial paradise, and in Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception, I'm sure that he would agree with Havelock Ellis. Now, it's quite clear from our studies of peyote and also from LSD that persons most prone to schizophrenia or dual personality are also prone to the most startling and lurid effects of peyote or LSD. And these may be said to have had a bad trip at times. On the other hand, it's also quite clear that there are few generalizations that can be made concerning the relationship between the personality and the effects of either peyote or LSD. They seem to affect different people differently. And it seems like each person is different from another. There are certain things like color and movement that seem to be common, however. LSD was accidentally found in 1943. It's relatively recent, by a man named Hoffman, Albert Hoffman. He had accidentally scraped himself with LSD, and he found hallucinations, visions, vivid color appeared to him. Timothy Leary, Dr. Timothy Leary, has recently emphasized the mind-expanding qualities of the drug. And the new man in the New World approach has been presented by him, as well as other drug-dependent individuals in all of history, as a matter of fact. We have not seen great change as far as this is concerned. I think I should say a special word about the drug heroin. The Federal Narcotics Bureau estimates that 82% of the drug addicts in the United States use heroin. A large percentage. Now, this is a derivative of opium. It was first synthesized in 1898, and it was thought at the time to be a cure for morphine addiction. So it was prescribed. People took heroin in order to get rid of their addiction to morphine. It has since been found to be the most potent and addicting of all drugs. What facilitated the usage of heroin, morphine, cocaine was the development of the hypodermic needle, the invention of this in the middle of the 19th century by Dr. Alexander Wood. The first needle addict was his wife, oddly enough. At any rate, this has facilitated the taking of cocaine, heroin, and morphine. Scientific advancement has made it thus much easier to be dependent on drugs. A needle, a flask, or vial, and one of the drugs in a dark corner is all that are needed for a greater jolt than at any time in all of history. More concentrated juice can hit you than at any period. Now, what are the trends in the history of the drugs abuse? This might be a question to be asked. Some drug historians and specialists have suggested that the trend in drug abuse is not to addiction or to habituation by any one drug, but to drug sprees in which several drugs are used, indeed quite a few at times, such as barbiturates and tranquilizers, energizers, amphetamines, narcotics, all being used. And these are being taken in a relatively brief time. They state that the old question of whether a drug-dependent individual is an addict in a physiological sense or is psychologically habituated to the drug is now meaningless outside of laboratory experiments with animals. The spree drug abuse seems to prove this, say these men. Such men as David Lewis and James Zinberg, particularly in their article Narcotic Usage in the New England Journal of Medicine, 1964. This has perhaps been recognized by the World Health Organization, for in that same year, 1964, it was decided to replace the terms drug addiction and drug habituation with a single term, drug dependence. And this is defined by that organization as a state arising from repeated administration of a drug on a periodic or continuous basis. Perhaps the trend is to regard the drug-dependent individual as one prone to such dependence due to personality disorders evident before taking the drug. Indeed, many suggest that drug-dependent people are sick people long before they have the drug.
Give Dr. Mackey a minute to catch your thoughts. I don't think it will be necessary to use the microphone for questions. If you have any questions that you'd like to direct to Dr. Mackey, I think he has presented in an excellent fashion the story and the origin of drug abuse from the beginning, relating to us some of the most important landmarks in this story, and perhaps identifying some of the more important terms that we will discuss in the next several days. Do you have any questions that you would like to raise?
Yes. You said that the drug LSD was discovered accidentally in 1943, but was there any real problem until just the last 5 or 6 years, or even less than that, as far as LSD?
No. It has come mostly after World War II. The most experience in the abuse of hallucinogenic drugs is post-World War II. Yes?
Evidently throughout history that the use of drugs becomes a moral question only in terms of how the society relates to the drug. In some societies, it's acceptable, like the peyote to the Indians, and it wasn't wrong.
It wasn't wrong to them, no.
No, it wasn't.
No.
But to our society, it's wrong.
Yes, it is.
I don't know.
But
Maybe 1,000 years from now, LSD and these hallucinogenic drugs would be acceptable to us.
well, there is a great difference. The use of peyote or peyote by the Indians was very restricted to religious purposes, and was administered by a priest of the religion, and it was used usually in a lodge in a religious atmosphere. This is at least the legal usage of the drug. So there is quite a difference between that usage and the so-called abuse of drugs in our society, which has no limitation whatsoever. And as I said, the people who used the drug, as I pointed out in the case of Aristotle, felt that they had a mission to support their society. And although illegal activities were committed, I'm sure, as they have been in all time, nevertheless there was a feeling that the society did not benefit from their destruction of the society through illegal activity, or something that was against the religion. Yes?
Do you think there will be any trend in the United States towards the legalization of marijuana? Or should we?
Well, the trend has already been here for some time, insofar as there has been a rising voice for the legalization of marijuana. I can't really answer this insofar as the future is concerned. As far as I know, there are as many people against it as there are for it, and probably more of the former at this time. However, for the future, I think it's too difficult at this moment to say. Yes?
Offhand, I was wondering if you could tell the reference of the circumstance of King David's giving poppy juice for him. Did I understand it correctly?
Now, it was for fits of depression and a melancholy and...
Do you recall the reference? I would be interested in that.
No, I don't remember the exact reference. Yes?
Kind of talked about the question of legality of most of these drugs. They have a good use, like opium has a good use.
Oh, yes.
It's just the misuse.
That's right. That is right. Opium has its medicinal uses, but I'm talking about the abuses generally here. Yes?
As you survey this through the centuries in your study, do you see that this is really such a rising problem, as it seems to be said by many people in our society? Has it always been kind of maintained through the centuries?
Well, there are several things responsible for our attention to this. One is the great amount of advertisement of those who are using it. Secondly, the more open usage of it. And thirdly, the organized criminal elements which have turned this into an agent for the enrichment of quite a few people. Particularly, the mafia are important in this. And these have been criminal elements ever since their inception, way back in almost in mythology in Corsica, or in Sicily, rather. Also, there is the usage of more and more drugs. There are more drugs now than ever before that can be used. There are greater amounts that can be taken through the hypodermic needle, which produces more of an effect all of this then brings a problem of greater magnitude than perhaps in former times, where in former times it was kept quiet, not advertised, little police investigation of individuals, particularly if they were of the right social group. This is not the case as much, although it still is the case, I think, in the United States, not as much as it used to be. It would be interesting in this connection to someday trace the drug or drugs to social groups, and what social groups use what drugs, and have they changed in history. An interesting idea some of you might look up. Are there any more questions? Yes?
Could you say something about STP?
Well, I haven't dealt with a number of drugs purposefully because of the lack of time, because also of the lesser usage of this drug, and STP is one of those which I have not commented on intentionally.
Any other?
I wonder if we could show our appreciation to Dr. Mackey.